Chapter 37, Working with the Gulf Cartel. The first couple times we picked up dope from Julio, Jose had us wait outside the apartment while he went in and brought the dope back out to us. Eventually, Jose brought me inside to meet Julio so he could fill me out and start working directly with me himself. The apartment we went to had nothing in it except a couch and a TV. Obviously, it was used strictly to store the dope and to conduct these same types of transactions. At that time, Julio had his younger brother posted up there to watch over the dope, but he was constantly moving around, renting these same types of apartments for this purpose alone. I was moving the dope quickly, and he knew I had a whole crew under me. Julio was a border brother, a Mexican national, but he knew about the NF and he liked the way we were doing our business. Eventually, Jose was eliminated as the middleman, and I started going directly to Julio myself. But me and Jose still had a business arrangement, and we continued to work together. By this time, the regiment was generating a lot of money, and the profits were adding up. Julio was letting his pounds go to me for $6,000, but I was dumping them for $7,500 and bringing back $1,500 for each one I sold. Both Turtle and Conejo were now moving anywhere from 3 to 5 pounds a week, while Sykes, Gato, and Pony were each good for 1 to 2 pounds a week. Willow and Angel was selling ounce here and there, but they weren't really moving any weight. Sometime around the beginning of January 2004, Jose took me to a limousine business on Zanker Road called Sharp Limousine. His cousin Cesar Ramirez was part owner of the company and had offered to sell us the shop he had first started off in before buying in the Sharp. The other business was just a small shop off of Gish that was only big enough to park 2 or 3 limousines in, but for us, it was a huge starting point. Caesar said he'd sell us an 18-passenger Lincoln Stretch for $20,000 to get us started, and that he'd also help us get everything off the ground, i.e., getting our business licenses, how to put together and promote our packages, employee payroll, the legalities, etc. Jose and I talked to Julio about becoming a silent partner in the business, and Julio was all for it. After buying the limo and getting the keys to the shop, Jose and I got everyone together at his apartment to discuss some of the shop policies we drafted. We also drafted policies in regard to how we expected the dope to be sold and other methods to circumspect security, i.e., when transporting a pound or more, they were required to drive in legit vehicles to maintain quality and competitiveness. They weren't to cut it. They were not to pick up any more than they could move within a 3-day period. Otherwise, they were subject to fines. They were required to sell the regiment's dope first before selling any of their own dope, etc., etc. There was a long list of policies that we drafted together to ensure everyone was on the same page. I considered Jose to have good business acumen, but our styles differed vastly, and I actually had to prepare my manpower ahead of time for some of the ideas he had. Even though some were a little uncustomary and outlandish, I allowed him to present his ideas just for the purpose of making him feel like his business ideas were being accepted. Jose didn't understand how to separate the legal from the criminal. For example, when we drafted the policies about how we expected the drugs to be moved, he wanted everybody to sign a written agreement and to put their initials down to serve as a binding contract. Even I thought this was way out there, but I told the manpower on the down low not to worry about it and that I'd destroy the papers after the meeting. These were criminals involved in criminal activities, and they all looked at this as something that could later be used against them. It's like committing a crime and then signing your name at the door, admitting your involvement. But prior to this meeting, I told my manpower to brace themselves for some of this guy's errant ideas and to play along with it, as it would benefit us all in the long run. Everybody knew I was utilizing them, and he was only being tolerated for a purpose. But this meeting was comical. Jose even went as far as bringing magic marker, a board, and erasers so he could conduct a full PowerPoint presentation. Around February 2004, Monster brought another individual by the name of Roger Carranza by my apartment, who was a tattoo artist known for doing work on a lot of homeboys. Roger converted his garage into a makeshift tattoo parlor and did some of the best work I'd ever seen. I seen a lot of his work on some of the other homies and told Monster to introduce us whenever he ran into him. Roger was from Gilroy and had been one of the original members of a street gang called 500. Now in his 40s, he stopped running the streets and settled down with his wife and kids. Between working a janitorial job at VMC, Valley Medical Center, Roger spent most of his time at home, either tattooing or just being with his family. I liked Roger from the first time we met, and over the next couple months, I continued to stay in touch with him. By this time, I was working hand in hand with Julio and had gotten to the point where he had completely trusted me. I ended up renting an apartment directly next door to mine, and Julio actually began to use it to store some of his dope in. At one point, I counted close to 100 pounds that were packed in 2 duffel bags stored in one of the closets. I actually thought about taking off with the dope and leaving San Jose, as this was $750,000. But after thinking long term, I ultimately decided against it. Sometime around February 2004, Pony was supposed to come by early one morning to drop off some money and pick up the outgoing filters and reports that were going back to Pinky and Corny. By now, Tammy had picked up a case and was in jail. Now we were using another female Pony had found named Debbie. She was a lot more reliable and Corny liked her. We paid Debbie to visit and passed my communications back and forth once a week. On the morning that Pony was supposed to come by, he was already about an hour late. This was becoming a habit and I was losing my patience with him. I had gotten to the point that I was threatening to start finding him. When I called and started yelling at him, Pony said he didn't want to come by because he found something underneath his Bronco that he thought might be a bomb. I wasn't in the mood for his excuses and really thought he was trying to play with my intelligence. I said, "Come on, bro. Are you really going to go to the extremes of offering me a lame-ass excuse like that? You need to get over here right now, and I want to see what you're talking about." When Pony showed up, he handed me a small black box with the transistor wire sticking out of one end and a small square box attached to it by another wire. Each box was lined with magnets on the underside so they could be affixed to a metal surface, such as under a vehicle. After looking at it, I said, "Come on, man, what fucking toolbox did you pull this shit out of?" But then I looked closer and realized that it might have been a GPS tracking device and that he might be telling the truth. Pony said when he was cleaning out the back of his Bronco, he accidentally dropped a screwdriver. When he tried to pick it up, it stuck to the floorboard as if it was magnetized. This is what made him look underneath the undercarriage and led to him finding the black box. As we talked, I walked over to my El Camino and took a quick look underneath, but didn't see anything. I looked under the front, under the bed, and then started feeling around under the bumper. As I reached under and hooked my hand inside the bumper, I felt something, grabbed onto it, and it came loose. It was another black box, identical to the one I was still holding in my other hand. My heart literally sank. I knew this was probably the feds. I looked at Pony and told him right there on the spot. I gave him the option to go back to his life and distance himself from the regiment, if that's what he wanted to do. I told him I wouldn't look at him any differently because I knew that if he continued forward with me, he'd obviously end up facing the same inevitable fate that I now knew was coming. I knew I was done, but he probably still had a chance if he cut out now. But Pony said he couldn't see himself cutting out on me like that and would ride it out to the end, and that's what he did. After we found the GPS tracking devices, I told Pony to put it back where he found it and not to drive to any of the homeboys' houses or anywhere else that he knew he shouldn't go. I also said for him to leave it alone and not to open it because if he took it apart, there was a good chance he'd break the signal and let them know that we were on to them. Before we put the devices back under our cars, Pony took Polaroid pictures of them. I wanted Debbie to take them on her next visit to show Corny. Pinky, Corny, Tibbs, and all the others who had been indicted in the Black Widow investigation were now housed in the Glenn McGuire Federal Detention Facility in Oakland. So it would be a lot easier to get these pictures up there as opposed to Santa Rita. When Debbie finally made her next visit and showed Corny the pictures, I really expected her to come back out with a message telling us to shut everything down and to let the heat cool off. That would have been the right thing to do, but that didn't happen. Instead, Corny just told us to tighten everything up and be on our toes. This was crazy. We caught a huge break by finding the trackers, and this was definitely our calling to climb under a rock and disappear. But his best advice was to tighten up the ship and to be on our toes. The obvious was clear. Their money far outweighed our freedom and our best interests. By this time, we were dropping anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 a week. They began to depend on it and even expected it. I always knew this was a greedy organization, but this was when I really started to realize that we were nothing more than servants to their needs. Corny and Pinky's selfish decision to keep us working upset me. I knew we were bound to get caught up, but continued to push the regiment forward, despite all the warnings. After finding the tracking devices, Julio decided it was time to move his dope out of the apartment. I didn't blame him either, as I would have done the same thing. Meanwhile, Monster began to experience some problems with his financial and living situation, so I offered to let him and his girlfriend Dulce move into the apartment next door to mine. To make matters worse, he jumped parole, so I tried to keep him off the streets. Vicky and I wanted to help them, as she had also gotten real close to both of them. Monster was still young and had somewhat of a wild streak in him. As a result, I was always riding him and constantly yelling at him. Vicky used to get a kick out of it, but at the same time, she always stuck up for him, telling me that I was being too hard on him. I did it out of tough love and fervently tried to keep him out of trouble. I also took a genuine liking to Dulce and wanted to see these two make it. One day, an incident occurred in front of the apartment that set off an ominous chain of events that would result in long-reaching consequences. I had been living in Campbell for almost 6 months and now realized that I was living directly in the middle of a Sureño-infested neighborhood. It wasn't so bad on my street, but the street behind me, Cadillac, was where all the Sureños congregated. I had numerous encounters with them and occasionally saw them walk by, but for the most part, I held back on going after them. I didn't want to make my apartment a target, especially since Vicky was living with me. But there was one Sureño in particular who had a habit out of riding by my apartment on his bike, throwing up gang signs every time he'd see me look out my window. One morning while getting ready to drive Monster to PG&E, I looked out my window and saw this fool coming down the street toward my apartment. Against all my better judgment, I ran down the stairs and waited behind a small pillar as he made his way down the street. I wasn't going to do nothing to this fool. I just wanted to scare the guy and then let him go, but things didn't end up happening that way. When he got almost directly in front of my complex, I stepped out, grabbed his bike by the handlebars and asked him, "What's your fucking problem? You got a problem?" This dude was about 3 inches shorter than me, and I had about 120 pounds on him. Suddenly, out of my peripheral, I saw Monster barrel down the stairs and rush out the entranceway. Before I could react, Monster was on him and had him running down the street. After he was gone, I threw his bike in my carport and we took off to PG&E. At first, I was a little upset because this fool knew what apartment I lived in, but at the same time, I initiated the whole incident. So there really wasn't much I could say. As soon as we left the PG&E building, Vicky called me in a panic, telling me that he had returned with 5 of his homeboys and that they were throwing huge landscape-sized rocks through all the windows. We jumped in my truck and blew through every light and stop sign, getting back to my apartment in less than 10 minutes. While we were en route, Monster called every homeboy he knew, telling them to get over to my apartment and to bring their guns with them. I told Monster that there were 2 baseball bats in the back of my truck, and when we got there, we needed to make our way to my El Camino, where I had a .357 under the seat. When we finally pulled up in front of the apartment, we jumped out and grabbed the baseball bats. Nobody was out front, so we assumed they were in the carport area. Monster checked, but they were gone. When I looked up at my apartment, all the kitchen and living room windows were broken and rocks were all over the driveway. Instead of going straight to my carport, I ran up the stairs to check on Vicky. When I hurried through the front door, Vicky was standing there crying with glass everywhere. Some of the rocks were still on the living room floor where they had landed. A glass end table was also shattered. I grabbed Vicky and hugged her, trying to calm her down, assuring her that we'd move out of there. After thinking about it, I felt bad because I put her in that situation. I never should have left her alone after what happened that morning and should have taken her with me. If something would have happened to her that day because of my actions, I would have gone on a complete rampage with a total disregard for any consequences or what might have happened to me. I always promised Vicky that I'd never allow her to get caught up in the bullshit of my lifestyle, and yet I had almost failed her. That same night, Pony and I drove to Home Depot and brought new windows to replace all the broken ones. I also retrieved a small cache of guns from Monster's apartment that I had stored in one of his closets. I placed a .357 on the kitchen table next to the window, a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun on the head of the couch next to the living room window, a long barrel .44 revolver on the dresser next to the bedroom window, a small .22 Derringer on the nightstand next to the bed, and a .45 semi-automatic on the living room end table. If these fools were gonna come back, I was gonna be ready. In retrospect, I really should have just packed up and gotten Vicky out of there. But at the same time, in my mind, I thought I was truly protecting her. I directed Willow and Angel to spend the next week living in the apartment with specific instructions on what they were to do if these fools came back. I still had about 4 guns in the other apartment, and I told them to keep these weapons accessible at all times. If they did come back, chances were they'd come from the front and possibly shoot at the windows. I was to cover my kitchen and living room windows, but if anything happened, Willow and Angel were to go down the stairs and secure the front, directly in front of the complex. Their whole purpose for being there was to secure the apartment. A couple days later, after the initial incident, Monster and Dulce asked if I could drive them to their storage to pick up their clothes and furniture. At about 5 o'clock that evening, we jumped into my truck and headed for their storage, somewhere off of Old Oakland Road and Monteque Expressway. As we pulled up to the intersection and stopped at the red light, a small Astro van pulled up beside me. Monster thought it looked suspicious. I looked over and saw a white guy wearing a baseball cap in his late 40s who was by himself. I noticed he had cleaning equipment on the passenger seat and thought he might be a janitor, or at least trying to pass himself off as one. As I turned left and started to pull into the storage place, we were quickly surrounded by 5 unmarked undercover vehicles. When they lit us up, Monster pleaded with me to take off, but I wasn't about to catch my 3rd strike for felony evading simply because Monster was trying to avoid a parole violation. Besides, Dulce was in the back seat, 2 months pregnant, and I wasn't going to endanger her and her unborn baby. The cops pulled us out at gunpoint and made us lay in the middle of the street before they cuffed us up and sat us down on the sidewalk. I was off parole and they had no reason to hold me, so they let me and Dulce go. But they took Monster in for being a PAL, parolee at large. The cop that pulled up next to us, Ted Lewis, apparently recognized Monster and called it in. I told Dulce she was welcome to stay at the apartment. However, now that Monster was gone, she felt uncomfortable and wanted to go back to her mom's house. Later that night, Pony came by to drop off some money and pick up some more dope. Aside from the guns stored in the closet there, I had a small safe that held anywhere from 30 to 40 ounces already packaged and weighed. This was the dope my manpower sold first. As I was using the proceeds from this money to meet my quota, I contributed every week to the organization's bank, or what was supposed to be the organization's bank. While Pony and I sat in the living room talking, Vicky came out of the bedroom and said she kept seeing a black Honda Civic drive up and down the street in front of the apartment with its headlights turned off. At first, I really didn't trip on it, but after she told me a second time, I got up to take a look. When I looked out the kitchen window, I saw the Honda drive by real slow. Then I watched it drive all the way up to the corner of Impala and Winchester and pull over. Then I saw someone get out and cross the street. As I stood there watching this figure get closer, I noticed he was wearing a hoodie, a dark hoodie, with the hood pulled all the way up tightly around his face. I watched him walk all the way down to my driveway and then he stopped. He hesitated as if debating whether to go into the carport or continue around the front toward my front door. I could tell this fool was up to no good, so I grabbed the .357 off the table and slid the window open and said, "Hey, who's that?" He seemed startled, looked up at me and said, "Hey, where's all the homies at?" As soon as he said that, he reached at his waistband and grabbed the butt of a gun. By the time he pulled his gun out, I was already aiming my .357 at him. We both started shooting, exchanging gunfire. I thought he had the advantage, only having to aim at a square window, where I had to shoot at a downward angle in an open area. As we shot at each other, I could hear the window breaking around me from his rounds, and they were getting closer. I ducked down and continued shooting through the wall in his direction as I made my way into the living room. When I completely unloaded, he took off running up the street. It took a minute for my ears to stop ringing since the .357 was so loud. I then ran into the living room and found Vicky lying on the floor crying. Pony was still sitting on the couch acting like nothing even happened. I lifted Vicky up off the floor, grabbed all the money and told Pony I was gone and would call him later. As Vicky and I rushed out the front door, I saw Angel and Willow both squatting down, looking around like two scared cowards. These fools were spooked and didn't even try to help me or follow any of my instructions. But this wasn't the time to deal with all that. I handed Angel the 357 and told him I'd call him in about 15 minutes. Vicky and I jumped into my truck and took off toward the prune yard on Bascom Avenue. We left so fast, we still had our house slippers on and Vicky left her purse behind. When we got to the Prunedale Inn, I pulled into the parking lot and suddenly realized I'd made a huge mistake. I knew the cops would go into the apartment and probably search it. The guns were still there and an ounce of dope was in the kitchen. I called Angel, not really expecting him to answer, but to my surprise, he picked up after the first ring. I knew they were probably in the other apartment hiding. I said, Angel, you gotta go back into my apartment and get the guns out of there. The cops are gonna be there any minute. He said, B, the door's locked and I can't get back in. I said, Angel, kick the fucking door in. Just get in there and get the guns out of there now. He said, okay, and started to hang up. I yelled, Angel, don't hang up the fucking phone. I mean it, bro. I'm giving you a direct order. I wanted to hear him get the guns and the dope with my own ears. Otherwise, I knew it probably wouldn't get done. After he handed all the guns off to Willow, I told him where the dope was in the kitchen. As he grabbed it out of the cabinet, he said the cops were shining their flashlights up at the windows. I said, go inside the bathroom and flush everything down the toilet. While he was flushing it, he said, B, they're coming up the stairs. I said, just stay there and be quiet. Angel said, B, they're coming to the apartment. I quickly hung up. What else could I do? That night, Vicky and I stayed at the Prune Yard Inn. The following day, we jumped on the freeway and headed back to Ukiah. While driving, I tried Willow's number, not expecting to get through to him. I knew Angel had gotten busted and assumed the cops evacuated the whole complex and took Willow too. The apartment was loaded with guns. There was a safe full of dope and I assumed they had found that too. To my surprise, Willow answered. I asked him where he was at. Willow said, I'm still in the apartment. I said, where's everything at? He said, right here. Willow said the cops went from apartment to apartment checking for victims, did a cursory search, and then left. I was shocked. I assumed they'd found everything, and I was definitely going down on my third strike. Now I was thinking I might still have a chance. I told Willow that Pony would pick up the dope and asked if he could take the guns to his house and hold them for me. Pony picked up the dope later that day and took it to his boy's house on Julian. Willow took off with the guns and said they'd be at his mom's house. Vicky and I stayed in Ukiah for about 3 weeks. During this time, I had Pony, his uncle John, and John's friend Tony go by my apartment and pack everything up for me. I also told him to grab the bromobenzidine, the chemicals in my carport. John said he'd have Tony take them to his house and keep it in his garage for me. The cops boarded up the doors and windows, but they managed to break into both apartments and get everything out. In the meantime, I asked Pony to keep his eyes open for another spot that I could move into out there. A couple days later, he called and said he'd found a house for me and we could move in as soon as the end of the week. Roger, the tattoo artist from Gilroy, was moving out of his house into a bigger place and said he could get me in as his sister-in-law owned the house. It was almost $1,800 a month, but a nice 2-bedroom home, so I jumped on it. After Vicky and I moved in and got settled, I got back to work with Jose trying to legitimize the limo business. We started booking private rentals here and there, but we're still in the beginning stages. We hadn't started marketing yet and didn't have a permanent driver. I was actually doing some of the driving myself. I just kept the middle visor up and avoided coming into contact with the customers whenever possible, as I definitely didn't fit the profile of a typical limousine driver. After the second week after moving back to San Jose, I still hadn't heard from Willow and was beginning to get upset. He had all the guns and hadn't made the effort to call anyone. Eventually, Pony, Conejo, and I drove to Willow's mom's house in the East Hills and tried to catch him there. Willow wasn't there, but his brother answered the door. I warned him that it would be in everybody's best interest if they got in touch with Willow and told him to call me. I told him, I know this is your mom's house and I'm not going to disrespect her home, but if I have to come back looking for Willow again, things are going to be a little different. His brother said he passed the message whenever he saw him, but I never got the chance to go back there a second time. Once again, it was around this time that I allowed myself to slip back into my addiction. I was stressed out and I knew the end was near. I could feel it. Everything around me began to feel like it was just all temporary. I had a lot of plans for our house and things I wanted to do, but got the sense that I wouldn't get the chance to see it all happen. After we found the GPS tracking devices, I knew I was on borrowed time, and after this last incident, I felt like I was running. The cops were probably looking for me, and I was definitely going to get slammed on my third strike. I tried to hide it from Vicky, but she knew me too well. That shit changed everything about me. When she eventually realized what I was doing, she would just look at me, shake her head, and go lock herself back in the bedroom. I knew she was disappointed, and it made me feel like shit that I let her see me get this weed. But this was my refuge. It gave me a temporary escape. It helped me slip into denial just long enough to suppress my fears. But deep down inside, I knew my problems would never completely go away. Over the next couple months, I slipped deeper and deeper into my addiction as things continued to escalate. I still tried to hide it. On my outward appearance, it was hardly noticeable. I didn't look like a rundown, dirty dope fiend who didn't take care of himself. I still dressed in new clothes, still had money, and still drove nice cars. I had a dealer's habit, and I still took care of myself. But this didn't make me any better, since underneath all the superficial masquerades, I was still strung out and being a dope fiend. Meanwhile, Roger started working with us and was beginning to sell small amounts of meth to make extra money on the side. He'd pick up anywhere from a half ounce to an ounce at a time and started coming by my house and working a lot closer with the regiment. He never made a commitment, and this was something we never discussed, but he was a close associate who became heavily involved in our business. By this time, I began to make a lot of money and didn't want to keep it at my place. I knew that if I ever got raided and they found the dope, they would seize the money. So I asked Roger if I could keep a safe in his garage. I told him that I was only going to keep money in it and didn't want to keep everything in the same spot, so he let me store it at his house. Every couple days, I'd go over there and drop a couple thousand in it, and it started adding up. These were strictly my profits and separate from the regiment's money. My plan was to get close to $150,000 and buy a house somewhere in Mendocino County. At that time, I was barely at $25,000. Around May 2004, I got a phone call from BJ, Baby Joker from Watsonville, asking if he could come out to San Jose and meet with me about something real urgent. I told BJ to come out that day and gave him directions to my house. I called Pony and told him to shoot by so he could meet BJ and hear what he had to say. Pony was still my second in command, and I wanted to keep him up to speed and abreast of everything that was happening in case anything ever happened to me. When BJ got there that evening, we went out to my backyard and sat down in the deck chairs. BJ said that him and his second had both found GPS tracking devices under their cars and believed that the feds were now watching them. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This only confirmed that the investigation was a lot bigger than I thought. I looked at Pony and just shook my head. Now I definitely knew it was the feds, because Watsonville and San Jose are in two different counties, which basically eliminated a sole local law enforcement agency running an investigation. A multi-jurisdictional investigation was usually conducted by the feds. At least that's what I thought. BJ had the same reaction when I told him that we had just found the same devices under our cars. I told him we took pictures of ours and showed them to Corny, but we were told to just keep working. Before he left, I told BJ to have his visitor tell Corny the next time he sent her up there, but in the meantime, all he could really do is be careful and to delegate as much responsibility away from himself as he could. A couple weeks later, toward mid-May, Corny sent word back through his visitor that he was sending Bubba from Salinas out there to see me, and I was to assist him with some type of special assignment. He said Bubba would explain it to me once he drove out there and touched base with me. Bubba called a few days later and said he was going to make the drive out there to discuss the assignment with me. After giving him directions to the limo shop, he showed up later that day with Melissa and Sophie's sister. The special assignment involved taking an individual out by the name of Memo, who he said drove a He said he'd get back at me when everything was set up and when it was time for me to drive back out there. He only stayed for a few minutes, but that's all he told me. I didn't say anything to Bubba, but I was a little upset that they wanted me to personally participate in something like this when I was the RC for San Jose. Why not send other C's or even NR members that weren't part of the leadership or management level? The only thing Corny's message didn't clarify was if I was to actually participate in whacking this fool or not. But Bubba made it sound like I was. It just didn't make sense to me, but one thing was definitely for sure. I was either going to have to participate if it really came down to it, or I was going to have to take Vicky and bounce. I actually sat Vicky down and explained this to her. She thought we should just leave, but instead I told her I'd just play it by ear and buy time for as long as I could. When they really pressed the issue and left me no choice, then we just pack up and go. I didn't want to turn my back on the NF like that and run like a coward, but Vicky was my priority and I wasn't going to abandon her either. Later, I'd find out that this individual, Memo, was actually Guillermo Memo Diaz, who was named as a target that they had conspired to kill in the Operation Black Widow investigation. On the following visit, after I met with Bubba, Corny sent me 4 more targets through Debbie that they also wanted stumped out. The first 2, Luis Huicho Gonzalez and Mark Caja Rodriguez, were both NF dropouts in old news. But the other 2 made me wonder if Corny, Pinky, and Tibbs were getting reckless. Kitty and Charles Castaneda, husband and wife, were 2 Santa Clara County prosecutors that had prosecuted some of the indictments back in the mid-90s that included a prosecution on Pinky. Gerald Cuete Rubalcaba had actually green-lighted to be killed both of these prosecutors and wanted to have them whacked as an offering for Pinky. Aside from this, there were also rumors floating around that these 2 prosecutors had actually appeared on a local television station and referred to the NF as trash and a bunch of punks. This definitely made it look more personal. In one of the FBI surveillance videos that recorded a meeting between Lizard and Happy Henry Cervantes from Lodi, Happy actually offered to do the job and press the issue. But Lizard was already working with the FBI and quickly dismissed the idea. Now, Corny was apparently trying to make good on this green light and indicated that they still needed to be taken care of for their personal assailments against the organization. I wasn't going to involve myself in this other matter with Memo, and definitely wasn't going to touch nothing that involved knocking off 2 prosecutors. Surely they had to know that something like this would provoke the kind of backlash on the streets from law enforcement that had never before been seen. And I definitely wasn't going to be a part of it. This was when I really considered taking off with Vicky and getting myself out of this. But I still wasn't ready to take that final step. I needed something else to push me. On one hand, I knew I needed to get myself out. Yet, on the other, I was still trying to keep my name good. Ultimately, I decided that I just couldn't do it. I couldn't walk away from the NF. I decided to wait it out while I continued to put more money away at Roger's house. Around the latter part of May, Joe Othomi Abeda had gotten my number from Shorty and called me once a week to keep me informed on what was happening in the county jail. I had appointed Joe to hold the RC position, but NF member Tomas Chopo McIntosh from Watsonville had since drove up and had taken over the position. This was the same Chopo that MC and I pulled back in 1997 while we were at the Adjustment Center in San Quentin. But I told Joe I still wanted him to continue calling me once a week to keep me updated on everything that was going on. The next time Debbie visited Corny, he sent word back that I was being considered for promotion to a Category 3. I would be designated as the street administrator and in charge of overseeing all the communications. From what I gathered, they wanted to cut down on the number of visitors from all the different street regiments coming up there as they were attracting too much attention. They wanted to consolidate all the communications by using one visitor. So I would have to pick up all the communications from Salinas, Sacramento, San Francisco, San Jose, Watsonville, Oakland, Santa Rosa, and the Valley. Sometime around the last week of May, Corny sent word through Debbie that I was officially being elevated to a Category 3. This was definitely an achievement, as I had finally reached a crescendo within my career, but it was also bittersweet. In NF parlance, I had attained a lot of credibility, but with everything going on, it just made it seem insignificant. Between the pressures I was feeling from law enforcement, the perplexity surrounding some of Corny's directives, and the disconcernment of my addiction, it just didn't have any real significance to me. Corny also wanted me to meet with his wife, Christina, and pick up a CD to review and secure. The CD was supposed to have been smuggled out by the lawyers and contained hundreds of pages of court-sealed documents, 402 hearings, active informant lists, FBI memorandums, debriefing reports, and other information related to the Black Widow investigation. I met with Christina a few days later and picked up the CD. There were a total of 1,956 pages of material on it, and some of the information was obviously meant to be kept under court seal. It was going to take at least a week to sift through every document, so Pony and I began reviewing it a few hours at a time. Toward the end of May, Roger started working with an individual by the name of Jose Largo Garcia out of Gilroy, who I've known since the early to mid-90s. Largo was a good homeboy and I liked him, but we started having problems with him as soon as he started working with us. We fronted him a £1/4, and almost after 2 weeks, he was still having problems paying it back. I assumed he had started using just by looking at him, but it got to the point where I had to give him a deadline and threaten to take his stepside, his truck, if he didn't meet it. Roger was the one dealing with him and was responsible for him, but after giving Largo his deadline, he started acting real shady. I didn't trust him and started to get bad vibes whenever he came around. One night, Roger called and said Largo wanted to drop by my place and talk to me personally. I only allowed a couple people to actually come by my house at the time, and he wasn't one of them. But that night, I agreed to it only because I thought he was either going to pay what he owed or come up with some other type of proposition. When Largo got there that night, there was something about him that made me feel real uneasy. On top of that, I could tell he had definitely been using. He had a dry mouth, his lips were chapped, and he couldn't sit still. The reason Largo wanted to come by was because he wanted to pick up a £1/4, but only had 1,800 and knew Roger wouldn't let him slide, being 200 short. Largo said he would flip it and then pay me back what he owed me by the end of the week. Something in my gut told me not to deal with him, but I ignored my instinct and did it anyway. After Largo left, Conejo came by and picked up another £1. He was supposed to come back with the money, but it was already getting late. I told him to call me early the next morning and I would just get the money from him then. While Conejo was still there, Pony dropped by to drop off some money, and then Julio called. By then, Julio was fronting us up to 5 to 10 pounds at a time, and he wanted to come by and pick up what money I had. He came by real quick, picked up about 20,000 and left. Pony left after around midnight. I stayed up until about 2 o'clock in the morning, reading over the material on the CD. Then I crashed out on my futon in a small room I had converted into an office. The following morning, I was awakened out of a dead sleep by the San Jose SWAT team smashing through my front door. As I was lying there in the observation cell reflecting back on all this, I heard my food port open and the tier officer say, "Mendoza, it's chow time, grab your chow."